Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When we get regulation right, we avoid disaster. When we get regulation wrong, we court disaster. Like on April 5th, 2010, when a massive methane and coal dust explosion ripped through the upper Big Branch coal mine in West Virginia of the Massey Energy Company, killing 29 miners, the country's worst coal mine disaster since 1968, when 78 people were killed in an explosion. Then, the 1968 disaster led to passage of the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which helped to cut workplace fatalities by 60% within 30 years. That's thousands and thousands of lives that were saved. But by 2000, right-wing propaganda and corporate greed had undermined enforcement of occupational and mine safety laws. The Massey Coal Company in West Virginia had hundreds of regulatory violations, but weak enforcement and regulatory capture meant that the company acted essentially with reckless impunity before the explosion took place. Just 15 days after that explosion rocked the mountains of West Virginia, another catastrophe rocked the Gulf of Mexico when BP's Deepwater Horizon oil drilling rig exploded and 11 people were killed there, and 200 million gallons of crude oil poured into the Gulf of Mexico in one of the worst oil spills in history. In response, the Department of Interior created the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement and put important rules in place to make sure this devastating chapter would never be repeated. But the Trump administration rolled back those regulations for creating what it called potentially unduly burdensome requirements for big oil to comply with. Now, Ms. Katzen, can you explain what the corporate crusade for deregulation means in reality, giving us a few examples?
Thank you, Mr. Raskin. I think it's fair to say that most businesses are very concerned about their bottom line, and they will seek to protect it. And to the extent that there are proposals that will increase their costs and thereby decrease their profits, that they rail against them and we've seen during different periods during President George W. Bush, there was a group that got together and came up with a wish list of regs to get rid of that had very little substance to them, and where the costs saved were minuscule compared to the benefits derived from them.
All right, and that's not because the corporations are evil. It's because they are rationally seeking their profits and they want to give the return to the shareholders. But the role of government is to regulate in the interest of the entire public, not just the people who profit from a particular business. The Clean Air Act was adopted in 1970, and in that 20-year period, it looks like the benefits were massive in terms of the health of the population, but also economically, those have been estimated to be in the range of $6 trillion to $50 trillion. That's what it's meant to our economy to have clean air in the country. So isn't the premise of regulation that it's not just going to take care of our people in terms of food safety and water safety and so on, but it's going to economically benefit all of society?
Yes, that is certainly a component of it. And while the Clean Air Act was passed in 1970, it was amended in 1990 because of its success, and the provisions for EPA were strengthened and enforced because so much good had flowed from the original act.
Yeah, no, nobody likes regulation, especially when we're talking about government theocrats telling women what kind of health care they can and cannot get in different parts of the country, or trying to restrict people's travel in order to keep them from getting the health care they want. But when we say we want to get rid of regulation in the abstract, everybody would agree to that. But as you were saying before, if we're talking about dismantling Clean Air Act rules, or Clean Water Act rules, or mine safety rules, or airline safety rules, vast majorities of the American people reject that. Isn't it true that an effective, functioning regulatory state promotes the freedom of the people?
I believe it does, and it promotes the economy. It's interesting that we're talking about death by 1,000 regulations at a time when the growth of jobs in this country is terrific. We've got less unemployment than ever, and the strength of the economy is remarkable. So I'm not quite sure how these two play together very well.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.